Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod, and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello and welcome back. This is episode 138. I'm on my own this week. Ned is hopefully going to bed upstairs. I've had a few late nights, as I'm sure all of you had. We watched the football last night. And everyone's just a bit overtired, including me. But this is a biggie, and I just want to get it done. This is one of the episodes that I've been researching for ages. And I've been referring to, and I asked on Instagram the other day whether people preferred a really long episode or two parts. And the majority said really long. And I know that I hate having to wait. I don't mind a two-parter if it's one comes out one day and one comes out the next day. But if I have to wait a week in between, I'll just wait for the full episode. So we're doing one long episode. That's what we're doing. So get comfy, make a cup of tea, prepare yourself, have trigger warnings for death, etc. Thanks for your nice comments about having Ned on the show last week. It was very sweet to hear from you that you were pleased that he was back. Luckily, he wasn't freaked out by our haunted hotel story. I, however, had a really weird experience. So that night, we were in Hay for 2 nights. We were staying at a friend's house, but it was just me and Ned in the house. I don't know if I made that clear. I did mention this on my Instagram stories. And we went to bed really early that night because he was basically just so excited for the next day. You know that thing when you're 11? He was so excited for the next day. He was like, let's go to bed now. And it was about 8:45. And I was like, you know what? Fine. So went to bed. I had a very spooky dream, not about haunted hotels, but about hauntings or something. Anyway, and then some noise wakes me up in the middle of the night and I can hear footsteps and I think, oh, it's Ned going for a pee. And as you do if you're a parent, most of us probably just stay awake until they go back to bed. And so I thought, right, I'll just stay awake until he goes back to bed. And then it wasn't Ned. The footsteps didn't stop. They were very loud footsteps for quite a petite 11-year-old boy. And for about an hour, I listened to quite noisy footsteps going backwards and forwards on the corridor outside my bedroom and his bedroom. And I say corridor or landing. I mean, I'd say it was about 6 foot long, max. 3 rooms off it, my room, Ned's room, and the bathroom. And as soon as we'd arrived, it's a very old cottage, and I said to my husband, there's something strange on the stairs, which he ignored, as he's wont to do with my weird ramblings. Anyway, when he texted the next morning and said, how are you? I said, I actually really freaked myself out last night. And so we went into it, and I said, I just lay there. And for what I'm really annoyed about is I didn't think to record it on my phone. I just lay there worrying that he could hear it and he was freaking out, but not wanting to go and get him and wake him up in case he was sleeping through it and I was then going to wake him up. Anyway, he did sleep through it. So I just lay there for an hour listening, and it had been loud enough to wake me up. Anyway, I told my husband the next day, and he said, oh, that's so weird. Last time I was there, I went to bed really pissed. We were all really pissed. He goes there for like boys' weekends. And I woke up. That in itself is pretty immense. My husband wakes up for no one. And he thought, I wonder why my friend's stomping around in the corridor in the middle of the night when we went to bed an hour ago and we were all really pissed. And he thought nothing of it at the time. But now it kind of makes sense. So that was spooky. Anyway, I went to bed the next night, fully charged phone, and was like, this is it. I'm going to capture this spooky happening, and it's going to be amazing. And I slept through. So either it didn't happen or I was asleep. More likely it wasn't loud enough to wake me up. Or I slept through it. It seems very odd because I definitely, when I first woke up, it was that startle awake of that you get quite often if you're a parent and you hear footsteps in the night. I'm tempted to just say mums because I don't think I know any dads that I know, but there's probably loads of single dads who would. But my husband doesn't startle awake at the sound of a child in the middle of the night, but I certainly do. So that was pretty spooky. But now we're gonna buckle up for this episode. At around 2:30 a.m. on the morning of the 7th August 1985, police at Chelmsford Police Station received a phone call from a man called Jeremy Bamber telling them that he'd just had himself a strange phone call from his father, Neville, saying that Jeremy's sister Sheila had, quote, gone berserk with a gun. The call from father to son then went dead, and so Jeremy was then calling the police. And the police agreed to meet Jeremy at the family farm in Tolshunt, Darcy in Essex. And when they get there, they are unable to get a response from anyone in the house. They spend 2 hours trying to get a response from someone in the house. They don't. They say they're not going in until it's daylight because they obviously there are weapons in the house. They've been told it is a working farm, I should say. So it's not really unusual in the UK for there to be guns in a farmhouse. It is unusual in the UK for there to be guns in a house normally. So they wait for an armed response team before they enter the house. And when they do, they discover the bodies of 61-year-old Neville Bamber, his wife, June, who's also 61, their daughter, 28-year-old Sheila Caffel, and her twin sons, Daniel and Nicholas, both 6. It would seem that Sheila, recently diagnosed as schizophrenic, had had a mental episode and killed her family before turning the gun on herself. But all is not as it seems. And so today I'm going to tell you about the story of the White House Farm murders. My sources today, there are lots and lots of people on Reddit who have thoughts on this, which is excellent. I love to see what other people think. Obviously, there's Wikipedia, there's miscarriageofjustice.co website, The Murders at White House Farm, Jeremy Bamber and the Killing of His Family, the definitive investigation by Carol Ann Lee, is quite a hefty tome. One of the reasons it has taken me so long to formulate my thoughts on this case is that I wanted to read that book. And to be honest with you, I'm still only about 78% of the way through on my Kindle, but along with all my other reading around this, I have formed my opinion. But if you want a really good in-depth look at this case, if it's one that piques your interest, then that's the book to read. So that's Carol Ann Lee, The Murders at White House Farm. But it is very in-depth. So we're in the UK in the 1970s and 80s. Margaret Thatcher, I was about to say, is on the throne. She's certainly not. Margaret Thatcher is Prime Minister. AIDS has just come to the forefront as a medical crisis. Madonna is on the radio. Live Aid happens. And especially the 80s, the early 80s, early to mid 80s, is a time to flaunt wealth. I think that's partly why I love 80s movies. I really do. You see these, Baby Boom is a great example. Big phones, power suits, lots of money, cocaine, parties. And that's sort of the same all over the Western world. And Essex is fairly close to London. It's sort of the blend of East London and Essex is a fine one. And we're going to Tolshunt, Darcy, which is sort of north of central Essex, where the Bamber family live at White House Farm. Ralph Neville Bamber, known as Neville, confusingly, and June Speakman marry in 1949. They meet when Neville, after the war, comes to Essex to do some farming, and he and her fall in love. Neville is described as calm, slow to anger, charming. He's 6'4". He is a farmer, and he's very fit and healthy. And he meets June in Essex when he's sent to work on the farm after the war, and they move to White House Farm, which is about 1 mile from the village of Tolshunt, Darcy in Essex. And they moved there in 1951. And June transforms the house and gardens, and they often have relatives to stay. They have various nieces to stay in the holidays. They have family that live abroad, and everyone says they love to go there. You know, June makes it really homely, especially in these early years. June has her own problems, which we'll hear about a lot later on. And she actually has a nervous breakdown in 1955, which some believe could be linked to not being able to get pregnant. She's desperate for a baby, and it's just not happening. She's in her mid-30s when she has an operation to remove a cyst, and this cyst leaves her completely unable to have children. So this operation leaves her completely unable to have children. So in September 1957, they adopt a little girl called Sheila, whose 18-year-old unmarried mother had been allowed to keep her for 2 weeks before being forced to give her up for adoption by her family. Sheila is the granddaughter of Eric George Jay, senior chaplain to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and her mother, who is, as I said, 18 and unmarried, is just really inappropriate in the eyes of society at the time to be an unmarried young mother, especially, I suppose, if your father is high up in the church. And so she has the baby adopted. And Sheila is 2 months old by the time she goes to live with the Bambas. And now you get support. There's obviously a lot of testing done with families and children for adoption, but also a lot of support. And I believe at the time, you basically were given your child and kind of left to get on with it. There's no support, and June is someone who needs support, and she is depressed. She basically, I feel, gets a kind of a form of postnatal depression where she struggles with motherhood, and she probably feels that she should feel different having wanted a baby for so long, and it is a very difficult situation. So she suffers another breakdown. She doesn't seem to respond to therapy or medication, so she opts to have electroshock therapy. Neville is incredibly supportive of June the whole time, and money isn't a problem. They do have money for medical care, and they do have money for support. So they have a 17-year-old girl who lives with them as a sort of full-time nanny, and she remains friends with the Bambas, and she is pivotal later on. She never sees any problem between them. You know, she never sees any violence in the house. They're a loving family. But obviously June suffers with depression, and we know that that doesn't mean that she doesn't love her daughter or that she is a bad mother. But we have this nanny who becomes a friend of the family to confirm that there was nothing sinister going on behind closed doors. So they decide to adopt again, despite June having mental health issues after the first adoption. And in the spring of 1961, they adopt a son called Jeremy. His parents met at a dance. His mother was a 23-year-old student midwife, and his father was a married sergeant in the army. Now, later, he would eventually leave his wife, and the two would marry. So Jeremy's parents do end up married with more children. Sheila and Jeremy are told they're adopted when they're 7. Jeremy seems unaffected by this, but Sheila, who is already a very tactile person and feels the lack of physical affection from her parents. Others around them noted that the children were spoiled and lacked boundaries. And I think this can be quite often the case where parents and children feel the need for different things. So the children wanted for nothing. They didn't have to worry about money. They were sort of allowed to get away with things. But actually, some boundaries and a cuddle for some go a lot further than anything you want, and, you know, not being forced to do things you don't want, I guess. Meanwhile, June's terrified that the children will be taken away. I have friends who have adopted, and I know that there is also the concern that, your children will choose to leave. And so she finds this difficult, but still, Sheila was sent to boarding school. I haven't quite got the age, but I think at about 11, and she's deeply unhappy, and she feels that this sending away to boarding school is a form of rejection. Now, she's eventually moved to a school closer to home, which she loves. She makes friends. She's much happier there. And Neville, who himself had been to boarding school and loved it, sends Jeremy to boarding school at 9. And Jeremy, also not a fan. He doesn't seem to get on well. He goes to a very good boarding school in Norfolk. And reports are that he doesn't seem to be a particularly appealing person. And again, it's this confliction between parent and child. Neville sends Jeremy to boarding school because he loved it himself. So I wonder if, for Jeremy, though, that feels like, I found out 2 years ago I'm adopted and now I'm being sent away again. Again, I've got people I know who were sent to boarding school who really felt like their parents didn't want them or didn't care. And that's not the case at all. So one family friend described Jeremy as, quote, growing up to be a fairly nasty piece of work. He was known to be cruel to animals. He was known to lie. He had a sort of inflated idea of himself. Sheila, however, seemed lovely and everyone seemed to like her. And when Sheila turned 13, June became obsessed with keeping her away from men. She is sort of fixated on it. And I think it's the start of the problems that June would face later on. But it's also the start of the problems that Sheila would face later on, because this sort of obsessive need. Sheila seems to be quite free-spirited. She is very beautiful, very attractive, and I assume had a sort of magnetic quality. But I think June can't enjoy this, give a bit of warning about men and life, and then enjoy her beautiful magnetic daughter. She is sort of fixated on keeping her away from men. June's 2 best friends die in quick succession, and she slips into another bout of depression. She spends time in and out of hospitals, and Neville is always at home. He is very constant, and this would really be important to Sheila throughout her life. When Sheila is 17, she's sent to finishing school in London, and while she's there, she meets 21-year-old art student Colin Caffell. They start a relationship, and she leaves her course to become a model. Interestingly, it should be noted that in a test shoot for her portfolio, she has one where she has to hold a gun and a brace of pheasants, and she has no idea how to hold the gun. It actually affects the photo. It looks weird in the photo. They can't kind of get her to understand how to hold it. There's no affinity or knowledge there at all. In the summer of 1975, 18-year-old Sheila discovers that she's pregnant, and she and Colin are very happy together, very much in love. They decide to get married. Trigger warning for this next part. June is horrified about the whole thing. It's almost like everything she was concerned about with Sheila. She's pregnant at 18, and this is a big concern to June. And when she finds the two of them sunbathing naked on the farm, she organizes and insists that Sheila gets an abortion, and she calls Sheila, quote, the devil's child. Now, Dr. Ferguson, who is Sheila's doctor later in life would say, quote, "In time she would hang her psychoses on these words." This telling Sheila she is the devil's child, it's almost like a switch goes off in Sheila's mind. Sheila and Colin move in together and get pregnant again in the spring of 1977. They get married. June, they want to have a lovely church wedding in the local church and then a marquee in the garden at the farm. But June refuses to let Sheila have a church wedding. June is very much a part of the church. And she says they have to get married in a registry office. Sadly, Sheila miscarries at 5.5 months. And to her, this is an act of divine retribution for the abortion she had a few years before. She wants to get back to modeling. She wants to put this behind her and have some time away. And she goes to work in Japan for 2 months. And it's here that she really seems to start to feel the effect of mental instability. She was still with Colin, still loved Colin, and wrote numerous letters to him. Obviously, this is the 70s. There's no email. There's no good phone lines. I mean, phone calls from Japan must have cost an awful lot. And in one of her letters, she says, quote, "I've never felt so confused or unable to control my brain before." She believed that she had begun to exude an evil aura and presence that people could feel, and that it sort of, maybe she felt this magnetism and felt that it had a negative effect. When she returns, Colin and Sheila move into a flat that Neville and June have bought for Sheila. Meanwhile, Jeremy is in sixth form. He's getting into fights. He's winding people up. He's kind of putting people's backs up. He's still arrogant. He is good looking by all accounts, and seems to know it, and seems to have a knack for pissing people off. At home, he'd wind Sheila up until she hit him. Then he'd laugh. He'd find it funny. But interestingly, he couldn't handle any form of criticism, and when faced with criticism, would often storm off. I'd say flounce off. His former headmaster described him as, quote, "untrustworthy and boastful." In 1978, Sheila falls pregnant again, this time with twins, and because of her previous issues with pregnancy and because it's twins, she is confined to bed rest at the Royal Free Hospital in London. And she's, I believe, slightly neurotic, as you bloody would be. She's confined to the hospital bed, and her marriage becomes strained. I think she feels like Colin isn't going through what she's going through. He is perhaps feeling powerless. For whatever reason, he begins an affair. The twins are then born prematurely. They're both absolutely fine, but they're early. And during this time, Colin moves out of the flat. He is, however, throughout an incredibly present and hands-on father. Jeremy at home, White House Farm, is showing no interest in the family business of farming. He is acting like as soon as he got his hands on it, he would sell it. Lots of people who know him at the time and family members say that he is only interested in money, notably obsessed with money. That's all he wants. And this is disappointing to Neville, who, loves the farm, loves farming, and lots of friends and family sort of work in farming and work in the area. So the fact that Jeremy is not only completely disinterested, but he's kind of obnoxious and unpleasant about it, must be pretty upsetting. Jeremy decides that he's going to go to Australia and New Zealand to work. He gets a ticket bought for him by his parents, and off he goes. We're not entirely sure what he does there. He does make some friends. There's lots of rumours about what he does there, including jewellery thieving, traveller's checks being forged, selling of drugs. It's hard to separate fact from fiction. He himself would later say that he liked a certain image of himself, and perhaps some of these stories were made to fit that image. After the birth of the twins, Sheila suffers with postnatal depression, and she very sensibly calls social services. She's become convinced that she's going to hurt her children, and social services get involved. What I find really interesting about this story throughout, though, is that social services are involved, psychiatrists are involved, doctors are involved. Nobody takes Sheila's children away. They're occasionally taken into foster or taken to their dads. They're always given back to Sheila. She's not considered of any harm to them. She's described as a very complex woman. She's fragile, warm, sociable. She's very lonely. And she asks to be referred to psychoanalysis. She asks for help throughout. She sort of seems very self-aware that all is not well and when all is not right. And she gets help. She gets daycare for the twins from a woman called Judith Jackson, and who she becomes friends with, who sees her most days and has lots of insight later on into Sheila's character. And in 1980, Sheila starts modelling again. And this is something that seems to be something she really wants to do, but she is perhaps not very good at. And by that, I mean, she is not very good in front of the camera. And I find this very intriguing because as a makeup artist, there have been times where I've turned up for shoots and you think, well, that person's nothing to write home about, but they really know how to be in front of the camera and they sort of transform. And vice versa, you can have incredibly attractive people that just don't know how to be in front of a camera and don't know what to look like, that photographs well. And I think that Sheila fell into the second category. So her modelling career sort of never properly takes off. She decides also to find her birth mother. She's open about this. Jeremy claims that he never wanted to find his birth parents, but his friends and relatives both remember him being in contact with them and them saying that they did not want to meet him, which must be incredibly upsetting, I would have thought. Some have theories that instead of blaming his birth parents for giving him up, he blamed Neville and June for adopting him. In May 1982, June is hospitalised again for depression and stays in the hospital for 1 month, and she is diagnosed with a paranoid psychosis. She is becoming more and more obsessed, filled with a sort of religious mania that becomes very noticeable and problematic for her close family. In July 1982, Sheila and the twins moved to a new flat bought by June in Maida Vale, and they seem to be doing well. Colin lives nearby. Many believe that he never stopped loving Sheila and vice versa, but for whatever reason, their relationship didn't work, but it wasn't at all seemingly acrimonious. He was very supportive of her. He had a new girlfriend who Sheila knew about, and that was all fine. Now, in the middle of the harvest in August 1982, Jeremy flies to New Zealand. No warning, He's helping with the harvest, and then he's going to New Zealand. His parents give him the money. He just says, I'm going to New Zealand. They give him the money to go. And again, there's various stories about what he does there. We know that he has a friend there called Brett, who would be involved with later. We know that he signed up for a deep sea diving course, but either didn't have the money to pay, he paid the deposit and then didn't have the money to pay the full sum, or he failed the medical, having had his skull fractured when he was a baby and had been dropped on his head. Now, if you're doing, murder bingo, being dropped on the head and having a skull fracture is something quite noteworthy, but it seems that we're not sure on this point. Now, again, stories circle about drug dealing, working as a barman, jewelry robbery, homosexual affairs. He's had lots of affairs with women at home, but we're unsure as to his relationship with Brett Collins and whether he's sort of forging travelers' checks. He definitely falls out with one group of friends. When he's there, he says he wants to come home. And when he does come home, Neville and June both find him changed. He seems willing to work hard. He shows an interest in the farm. And he seems happy to knuckle down for once. He's not always banging on about money. Neville's cousin, Chris Neville, confusing, comes over for the Christmas of 1982, and he gets on well with Sheila. I can't remember I think he lives in America, but he comes over and he gets on well with Sheila, but he says Jeremy, quote, seemed to treat his mother in particular like dirt. Though he's been working hard, he's once again fixated on money. He always seems to have some form of ulterior motive. Now, the farm is a working arable farm, I believe, but they also have a family caravan park called Ossie Road. Now, Ossie Road is run by Neville, and June's niece, Anne, is basically in charge of it, and Jeremy works with them. Sheila has, I would say, a better relationship with her parents than Jeremy, but Sheila's relationship with June becomes strained as June's religious mania sort of intensifies. Sheila finds this very difficult, and we know that Sheila feels like she's evil. Sheila feels like she is, as her mother said, the devil's child. And so I think the two together probably makes a very unstable situation. Now, on the 4th of August 1983, Sheila is again admitted to psychiatric hospital, where she shows clear signs of schizophrenia. She believes herself to be inherently evil. She's never violent. She's just bewildered. And Neville is deemed critical to her recovery. He's strong, he's caring, he's supportive. They're incredibly close. He seems to be her North Star, as it were. He is everything to her. So he is, where June may be a bit antagonistic, Neville is sort of calming and supportive. Meanwhile, Jeremy starts dating a woman called Julie Mugford. He sweeps her off her feet. He's very charming, but he cheats on her constantly. And she would later say that he doesn't like his sister. He's very jealous of her because she seemingly does nothing and gets supported by her parents. She has flats bought for her. They will do anything for her. They put her in hospital. But he would later say, when faced with this, quote, I had everything there that I wanted. He was getting paid 18 to 20,000 a year for his working on the farm and the caravan site, camping site. He has a company car. He also started growing and selling and smoking a lot of cannabis. And he too lives in a house owned by his parents in the village of Goldhanger, which is about 3.5 miles away from White House Farm. So he seems to be jealous of his sister, but he has basically the same, just differently. Now, on the 30th of November 1984, Neville and Jeremy go to Radcliffe's gunmakers on Colchester High Street and buy a 22 Anschutz rifle, 10-shot magazine, telescopic sight, 500 rounds of ammunition, a sound moderator, and this is for Jeremy. It would be kept at White House Farm. Neville was meticulous about storing all guns in a padlock cupboard. I don't think in the 70s, I can't remember when our laws came in about guns. You do have to have a license in this country. That license has to be renewed, and you do have to keep guns locked and the key hidden, and only the person with the license should know where the key is or how to get into the gun cabinet. But I think in 84, they were a bit more lax. But Neville was very meticulous about storing the guns in a cupboard that was padlocked. And as I said, they're farmers. It is quite usual for them to have guns. Now, that Christmas, Jeremy proposes to Julie, and they plan to marry after Christmas. He would later deny this happened, though Julie says it happened, and other people remember them talking about it. Meanwhile, Sheila, she's withdrawn and depressed. She seems very frail and slow. She's chain smoking, and she's on this monthly injection for her schizophrenia that makes her sort of incredibly vacant and out of it and weak. Sheila is withdrawn and depressed. She's troubled with the religious rantings. She seems frail and slow and vacant. She chain smokes. But she's not the only one affected by June. The twins also dislike the fact that June makes them pray all the time, and they find that very difficult. And they say to their parents that they don't like it when she does that. And in fact, Colin speaks to June on a number of occasions about, can we not force the boys to do all this praying? It makes them feel very uncomfortable. Now, in March 1985, Sheila is diagnosed with schizophrenia. She's had an episode where she's hearing voices from God and the devil. And her doctor maintains over the following years that he is never concerned about her harming herself, her kids' father, her father. If anything, she would harm her mother, but only if she was terrified and believed it was for the best. She's never violent. She's more weak and frail and bewildered and confused. And she starts on this monthly antipsychotic injections. And this gives her debilitating lethargy. On the last Monday of March, £970, which is just over £3,000 in today's money, is stolen from the caravan site. There's a broken window, but everyone is immediately suspicious. The leaflets on the windowsill are undisturbed. There are no footprints in the mud around the window. It seems to pretty much everyone that Jeremy is the perpetrator. On the 29th of March, Sheila is discharged to White House Farm because she's entrusted to their care. She's still behaving very strangely. And she's looked after there. That Easter, Jeremy has a huge fight with his mother, June. We're not sure what it was about. He's very tight-lipped on what that was about. But family believe that he had found out that she had changed her will in favour of the twins. Now, Neville left everything to Jeremy if he was farming, which would have been about £460,000, which is 1.5 million in today's money. So Jeremy gets everything in Neville's will. In June's will, he believes, or it is believed, that everything gets left to the twins. In mid-April, Sheila returns to London. She's still extremely listless. She meets up with her birth mother, Christine, who comes over from Canada, and they get on brilliantly. Christine seems to really understand her daughter. She's very nurturing. Colin said Christine was, quote, the catalyst in Sheila's recovery that gave her hope. Now, weirdly, in June, Neville says to his farm secretary, Barbara, who has worked for him for a long time, quote, if something happens to me, do you promise to look after the farm? He goes on to say, I wouldn't be surprised if it happened to me whilst out shooting. She finds this very strange. He just says, oh, well, we've all got to go sometime. He also makes a note of songs and readings he wants at his funeral. And around this time, Jeremy also says to his uncle, I could easily kill my parents. His uncle replies, don't be so stupid, and walks off completely furious. And Jeremy says to his cousin, Anne, OC Road will, quote, belong to you and me in 2 years' time. Just wait and see. And she finds this very odd. She initially, I think, thinks, have Neville and June said that they will sign it over to them. They definitely had plans in the family to give some land to Anne's family, June's sister's family. So she thought, is it something to do with that? And June starts to speak to her solicitor about Sheila managing her own financial affairs rather than June managing them, I believe. So she was going to give Sheila £740 per quarter. And there was also talk of Sheila working at OC Road. In her last diary entry, Sheila writes, quote, I didn't mean to be horrible to Jeremy. Nobody knows what this refers to. Jeremy would deny all knowledge of what she's talking about. And there's very conflicting ideas of his relationship with Sheila, as we'll hear in a minute. He says in some interviews that, you know, he was concerned about her mental health, but he loved her. In other people say that he didn't like his sister. Now, on the 4th of August, Colin drops Sheila and the boys at White House Farm. They're going to stay at the farm for a while, and then the boys are going to go to Greece with Colin. Sheila is really detached and vacant. Colin stays until about 8:30. He says he feels uneasy leaving the children there. They're very distressed when he leaves. Daniel, who the twins are now 6, Daniel has been drawing very disturbing pictures in the days leading up to the visit to White House Farm, and these are given to Colin's mother for safekeeping, but everyone finds them a bit concerning who's seen them. Colin would later say that he believed that the twins had a premonition. They weren't usually that upset when he left, and Sheila is very vacant and distant and lethargic. So now we're back onto the night, early morning of August the 6th, 7th, 1985. And Jeremy has been at the farm. He takes his gun out to shoot some rabbits. He says there's no silencer and no sights on the gun, but he doesn't find any rabbits, and he puts the gun down in the house without firing a shot. He then goes out to finish getting the rape in. It's the rape harvest. What do you guys call it? Canola. Canola? Trying to be Australian. Canola. I can't remember. And then he leaves to go back to his house at 9:30, and people hear and see him driving off. Neville, at this time, gets a call from his secretary, Barbara. She's been asked by Neville to see if she can find a bicycle for the twins, and he's really snappy with her and hangs up the phone, something he's never done to her before. She finds this very out of the ordinary. And just before 10, Barbara's son drives past and sees Neville in the tractor in the rape field, still getting the harvest in. At about 10 past 10, June speaks to her sister, Pamela, Anne's mother, and says she's worried about Sheila. Sheila speaks to Pamela for about 2 or 3 minutes, and Pamela would later say it was like speaking to a zombie. She's just still completely out of it. Someone else drives past the farm and sees Neville on his tractor at 10:30. From then on, really, we only have Jeremy Bamber's words for what happened. We know that he called the police. Interestingly, he calls the police station direct. Rather than calling 999, he looks in the phone book for the number for Chelmsford Police. So he allegedly gets the phone call from Neville saying that Sheila has gone berserk with a gun, and rather than calling 999, he looks through the phone book to find the Chelmsford Police Station. There's also a question as to why Neville would phone Jeremy and not the 999 himself. Jeremy's answer to that is that he wouldn't want other people involved. First on the scene are Sergeant Chris Buse, Constable Stephen Mayle, and Constable Robin Saxby. They get in their car at 3:55 a.m. to go to the farm. Jeremy arrives 2 minutes later, although he lives much closer than they do, and he seems remarkably calm. From this time, there is a police log and radio log. Some of the times are off, and this will come up in court later on. Police try calling the farm phone line. The phone is shown to be off the hook, which fits with Jeremy's story that his father phones up, says Sheila has gone berserk with a gun, and then the line goes dead. Police ask Jeremy who his sister is going to be more annoyed to see. They think if she's still armed, is she going to be calmed by seeing her brother? And he says, both of us, I don't get on with her at all. I don't like her and she doesn't like me. At 4:58 a.m., firearms tech arrive, and for 2 hours they try and make contact with anyone inside the house. Jeremy jokes with police that if anything's happened to his family, he could sell Ossey Road Caravan Park and buy a Porsche. So we need a trigger warning now because we're going to talk about what is found in the house when they get there. Neville is found in the kitchen. He has been shot 8 times, initially in the bedroom, with injuries that would have actually prevented him from being able to talk on the phone. He then goes down to the kitchen where he has been shot and beaten. In total, he's been shot 8 times. 6 hit his face and head. So they think he's been shot 4 times upstairs, managed to get downstairs where a struggle took place, during which he was hit several times with the rifle and then shot again, this time fatally. There are 2 wounds to Neville's right side and 2 to the top of his head, which probably resulted in unconsciousness, and they think that he was hit with the barrel of a rifle. The left side of his lip was wounded, his jaw was fractured, and his teeth, neck, and larynx were damaged. The pathologist said, quote, he would not have been able to engage in purposeful talk. There were also gunshot wounds to his left shoulder and left elbow. Upstairs, June was found lying on the floor near the entrance of the master bedroom. She was found in her nightdress with bare feet. The police believe she'd been sitting up during part of the attack, based on the pattern of blood on her clothing. She had been shot 7 times. 1 shot was between the eyes and the other on her right arm and chest, but it was believed a shot on the right side of her head is the one that had actually killed her. The twins were sadly also found shot dead in their beds. Daniel was shot 5 times in the back of the head. Nicholas had been shot 3 times at basically point blank range. Sheila was shot twice under her chin, both shots fatal, though the first shot was a slow bleed from a nicked jugular vein with blood pooling in the neck, and the pooling showed that she hadn't got up. Sheila was found on the floor of the master bedroom near June. She had a gunshot wound on her chin and another in her throat. And it was later discussed that Sheila was too short in height to be able to reach the trigger to shoot the gun under her throat, though this would depend a lot on whether the silencer had been fitted or not. The pattern of bloodstains on her nightdress suggested that she'd been sitting up when she'd received both injuries and had not got up. The rifle without the silencer or sights was lying on her body, pointing up at her neck, and June's Bible was lying on the floor to the right of Sheila. It was normally kept in the bedside cupboard. June's fingerprints were on it, as were others that could not be identified, including maybe one made by a child, but we know that she often made the twins pray and read the Bible. Noticeably, there was a shard of wood missing from the rifle butt that was later found downstairs next to the Aga. Now, the main policeman in charge of this is Taff Jones, and he goes in. It takes a while for it to be realised that there are 2 wounds to Sheila. Everyone believes there is just one initially, and it is decided that this is a clear case of murder-suicide by Sheila Caffel. Because it's decided that it's murder-suicide, no pathologists come to the crime scene, and it's never properly catalogued and investigated. We do know that Neville put up one hell of a fight. He obviously was shot upstairs, made it downstairs, was beaten and shot again in the kitchen. Very interestingly, and it was noted by everyone at the scene, Sheila has very clean hands and feet, incredibly clean feet, to the extent that one idea would be that if she had committed these murders, she would have had to then go and wash her feet before turning the gun on herself. But because this is initially ruled as a murder-suicide, lots of people come in and out of the house. Obviously, it's the 80s, but it's not treated in a way that perhaps the crime scene should have been treated. Jeremy is there. The dogs, there are 2 family dogs, his mother's small dog and his father's Labrador, who is out in one of the sheds, and they've both been barking. Jeremy says the dogs should be taken away and put down. He doesn't want them. He's not fussed. He gets back to his house at 10 a.m. with a policeman who goes back to interview him. And Jeremy says, "Oh God, I'm starving," and makes himself a bacon butty. Now, he would later comment, "Oh, I hadn't eaten since the night before. I was really hungry. Everyone makes such fuss about me having a bacon sandwich." The policeman doing the interview was surprised that he was having a bacon sandwich. And I do think if you've just found that your entire family has been brutally beaten and shot, I mean, my husband threw me a surprise 40th birthday and I couldn't eat for about 24 hours. I do think it's interesting to not lose your appetite when you've just found out your entire family has been brutally killed. Initially, this whole thing doesn't sit right with a lot of people. And part of that is to do with whether Sheila, in her weakened state, would be able to even handle a gun and overpower 6'4" Neville. The police speak to her doctors. He says he can't ever imagine her feeling anger towards her father or being able to do this to her father. He is such a calming and pivotal figure. But the decision has been made, and Taff Jones will not bend on this. He says it is 4 murders and a suicide, and the house is actually stripped of any carpet sections, bedding, etc., with blood on, which is then taken away and burned. Forensics are never in the house. Photos are taken, but things are moved before photos are taken. Now, Sheila, a toxicology report is done on Sheila, and they find that she smoked weed a few days before. She was consistently taking medication, which would mean that her mood was controlled, not that she was, quote, going mad, which is what Jeremy had described her as. And that's very interesting as someone who takes long-term medication. It's actually not the medication that makes a difference. It's the lack of that could potentially cause problems. But her toxicology showed nothing unusual, and the consistent taking of the medication, which we know was making her feel very lethargic. Now, Jeremy is talking to the police quite happily. He is constantly telling lies about Sheila. He says that she was expelled from school, that she'd hit the twins. None of this is true. She wasn't expelled from school at all. She'd never laid a finger on the twins. Sheila's best friend, all of Sheila's friends call her Bambi, which is quite sweet. And that she said in the days before the shooting that Sheila was so weak from her medication that she could barely get off the sofa without help. And an ex-boyfriend of Sheila's said she didn't even normally have the manual dexterity to reload a rifle. Anne and David Bootflower, I think is how you could say it, go for a meeting with Taft Jones, and they comment that the rifle without the silencer would have been incredibly loud. So both 6-year-olds were found in bed, so it's hoped that they were asleep when they were shot, and it seems very unlikely that anyone could remain asleep in a house where a rifle has been fired, especially one that's just been fired 5 times into the bed next to you. They also were very shocked because they heard that the number of bullets fired, which was at least 25, would have meant reloading the light rifle not once, but twice. Anne then said Sheila cannot possibly have done it. She just wouldn't have been able, she wouldn't have had the knowledge, she wouldn't have been able to reload this weapon twice. Especially if you think about the fact that you're reloading while some people are still alive in the house. You're not going to want to be faffing around with it for ages. Jones gets incredibly angry. He screams at them. He says that's, it's murder and suicide. He really treats Anne in a very sexist way. And it's this interview really where the family start thinking, hang on, how is she supposed to have reloaded this rifle twice? She's completely out of it. She doesn't know about handling guns. And Jeremy, meanwhile, says that she did know how to shoot guns, and they shot guns when they were younger. Jeremy also says to the family that the Henry Smith trustees who owned the farm had given him notice to quit as the contract was with their father. Now, his uncle, Peter, thinks this is very doubtful. It would be assumed that in the event of the death, Jeremy would take over the farm. If that's what he wanted, there's no need to rush. It's obviously a very upsetting time. So the trustees were not going to suddenly phone up and say, you've got to get out of the farm. There's a big family argument. We're not entirely sure what that's about. Jeremy's given Valium by the doctor, which he seems to take consistently for the next God knows how long. Jeremy also says that he's arranged for Sotheby's to come and value the furniture and contents of the house, and he never wants to set foot in there again, he tells Anne. He says he keeps seeing their faces, but he didn't go in after they were murdered. And interestingly, his girlfriend, Julie Mugford, is the one who goes to identify the bodies. She volunteers. So Jeremy has said, I never want to set foot in there again. I keep seeing their faces. We don't know what that means. He hadn't seen them dead. And June finds this very strange. And Anne finds this very strange, but she goes into the house to deal with a lot of stuff. And Anne has said that she would like to give June's engagement ring to her mother, Pamela, June's sister. And Jeremy says, no, it must be cremated with June. Nothing is to be taken out of the farmhouse. I should just say that you're not cremated with your jewellery. So they would have taken it off. Anyway, when Stan Jones, very confusing, there's Taff Jones who's in charge, Stan Jones who is less in charge, who from the get-go has his reservations about Jeremy. And he says that when he interviews Jeremy is very keen to know what order his family died in, because he had been told it would affect the will. And so he keeps asking Stan Jones if he knows what order the family die in. And he is taken to carrying around wads of cash. Interestingly, when Anne goes into the house, she oversees a lot of the clear up and, sorting out of stuff. And she cannot find June's everyday handbag. June, like lots of us, has had a couple of handbags, evening ones, dress ones, but she had one that was her run-of-the-mill everyday handbag, and this has never been found. It was never in the house. Anne's never seen it. And that's very interesting. One thing that is very noticeable is that in the initial search made by the police, they do not find the silencer for the gun. The gun is found on Sheila's body without the silencer, making it her just able to pull the trigger to shoot herself in the neck. When the family are looking through the house, in the cupboard that was often used to store guns that I believe would have a padlock on it, they find wrapped in paper the silencer for the gun. And when they find this silencer, they find what appears to be deposits of red paint, and it feels sticky to the touch. And then they see what they then realize to be blood. They describe it as being like a blob of jam. And Anne, Peter, and David believes that if this is blood, if the gun has been used with the silencer, then Sheila is not guilty of murder. There are loads of guns throughout this house, and the family give this silencer to the police, but it is mishandled. Lots of people remember seeing a grey hair on it, but the grey hair is lost in transit. It's not packaged up very well. So this is a sort of bone of contention for the whole trial. This is a problem. The handling of the silencer, the fact the police didn't find it. But we have to remember that the police were told this was a clear-cut murder-suicide, so they didn't search in a way that they would if this was a murder of 5 people from an outside person. So separately, the family are all becoming suspicious of Jeremy. Certain things are bothering them. For example, there is a spare key kept in the coal shed, and the family know this. Spare keys to the kitchen door. But in the hours that they were outside the house before they went in on the morning of the 7th of August, all the doors and windows were shut and locked, and the police ended up having to break down the door because Jeremy didn't have a key. But he knew the key was there, and he was asked if there was a key, and he said no. They find that weird. Contrary to what he had said before, Jeremy does go back to the house and shows him round, and he seems afraid rather than upset. He goes and sits on his father's chair, puts his feet up on the table. He looks for his father's wallet and then calls the police to report it missing. And he's so relaxed that Robert gets rather angry. Robert is his cousin-in-law, Anne's husband, and he gets furious And basically he decides he's going to go and tell his suspicions to Stan Jones. They just don't, something about Jeremy's behavior is not adding up for the family. And on the 12th of August, there's a meeting to discuss things that didn't fit right with the forensics team, who have now been given the silencer. And there are certain things that they are just not sure about. On Wednesday, the 14th of August, there's an inquest. There's blood on the outside of the silencer, which has been decided to be human. They've discovered that it's human. They haven't yet got a blood type on it. The deputy coroner gives a 2-month adjournment so that they can continue their investigation, but gives permission for the funerals to take place, which is a decision that some police would later say was a serious error, because obviously Jeremy had everyone cremated. Jeremy, meanwhile, goes through the house with Sotheby's. He says to Anne, "Do you want to come and see the goodies?" And he has everything laid out on the floor in the master bedroom, including a clock that was Sheila's. And he says, "Well, it's mine now." When asked if he's going to put them away, he says, "No, when I come into this room, I like to see nice things." And Anne was like, "I thought you were never going to come into this house again. And now you've got everything out on the floor." Interestingly, she would say she never saw any of those things again. Jeremy's friend Brett comes over from New Zealand. And he's kind of a sinister character in all of this. He's very close to Jeremy. We're never sure of what their relationship is, but he is there in the house with Jeremy. Meanwhile, they match the paint on the silencer to the paint on the mantelpiece in the kitchen, which has big noticeable gouges in it. So they think that in the struggle with Neville, the paint, the silencer scraped on the mantelpiece, and that's where the paint comes from. Now, Jeremy is talking about money all the time. Every time he goes to the farm, he looks for money that he's sure his father has hidden around the house. He's talking about what he's going to buy with his money. And his mother's bicycle is found propped against the wall at his house. It's usually kept up in one of the outbuildings at the farm. It's how she gets to church and to town usually. So it's very weird that it's at Jeremy's house. He doesn't really have an explanation for why that is. August the 16th is the day of the funerals for the family. Jeremy's taking Valium. He sobs as he leaves the church, and that's what's shown on the news. And then as soon as he's away from the church, he is cracking jokes. And his old housemaster phoned the police and said, quote, "It seems to me that Bamba was acting. My wife, who was also watching with me, made comments about it. And others noticed it too. He was sort of sobbing when there were media there, and then fine the rest of the time. He was cracking smutty jokes. He seemed impatient to get home. At the wake, he opens the front of his Hugo Boss jacket and says, "That's me now, the boss." Monday, the 19th of August, is the twins' funeral, and Colin sits by their coffin and reads them their favourite book. They are buried in a cemetery in London, and Sheila's ashes would be buried with them. Peter Eaton is officially appointed farm manager, and he gets confirmation from the trustees that they had never given Jeremy notice to quit or anything of the sort. They hadn't bothered him at all. So they can't quite work out why he's said to people that he's been given notice to quit, and he's been, I believe he said that they were going to fine him if he didn't. Also, there's confusion between the family and the police about phones at the farm, because obviously Jeremy's contacting of the police started because his father phoned him and said that Sheila had gone berserk. Now, there were 4 phones at the farm, 2 in the kitchen. One was a cordless one that June did not like, and that was actually away being repaired. It had been picked up a few days earlier to be taken away to be repaired. There's one on Neville's desk in the office and one in the master bedroom, which sometimes got taken downstairs to the kitchen. If the buttons broke, I believe it got taken downstairs, the buttons were fixed by Neville, and then it was taken back upstairs. On the night of the murders, the cordless phone had been taken for repair. The master bedroom phone was on the kitchen worktop. There was no blood on it. The other kitchen phone was later found by Anne among some papers and magazines. Jeremy, when asked about it, said it was a spare. It was not a spare, it was the kitchen phone. And it actually looked like it had been hidden. With the bedroom phone downstairs and the other phone hidden, the Bambas would have had no way of calling for help when the attack started. It would also explain why it looked like June had reached across the bed when she was already wounded and why Neville had gone downstairs. He was obviously just able to go downstairs. But if he was able to go downstairs, why could he not call for help from upstairs? Well, because the upstairs phone was not there. They also were having a look round. When they had arrived, all the doors and the windows had been locked. And so they were looking around to see if there was any way you could get in or out one of the windows. And they discovered that they could open the kitchen window, climb out, replace the things on the windowsill, and then push the window from the outside, and the catch would reclip. And so that was an easy way to get in or out of the kitchen. And it was known that Sheila and Jeremy would get in and out of the house this way. Julie Mugford is still in her on-again, off-again relationship with Jeremy. She's suspicious of his relationship with Brett, and she eventually, when Jeremy breaks up with her, she takes this very badly. She is very upset, but she breaks down and tells a friend that Jeremy asked his friend Matthew to kill his whole family. Having killed the family with the gun left out for him by Jeremy, hence the whole rabbit shooting story, he did call Jeremy from the house, so the call log would fit with Jeremy's story of Neville calling him and telling him that Sheila had gone berserk, and then Jeremy would call the police. This is obviously huge. Julie's friend says you've got to tell the police. Interestingly, June's mother at the same time has changed her will. She's very old and infirm and close to dying. She changes her will to leave everything to her remaining daughter, Pamela. They are concerned that if Jeremy inherits anything, he will sell off all this family land. So it's not until the beginning of September that Julie finally contacts the police. She told friends that he'd paid a man called Matthew to do it, but she then goes to the police and tells of Jeremy carrying out these murders. And the police who are present say that it is like jigsaw pieces falling back into place. Her initial interview lasts 3.5 hours, and it's just basically all the missing pieces that they have not understood about the story. She said that he'd started talking about wanting his parents to be dead in July of 1984, about 7 months after they started dating. And she'd always said to him, "Oh, stop saying that. I don't want to talk about it." And by October was talking about drugging them and sneaking back to the house on a bike through the back lanes and then setting fire to the house. At the beginning of the year, Jeremy seemed more content. He had a better relationship with his parents. But by March, he was talking about murdering them again. And this time he planned to shoot them, exit through a window in the kitchen, and then make it look like someone else was involved. Julie was upset and cried and told him not to talk about it. I mean, it seems that Julie was very much in love with him and sort of fully signed up to the Jeremy Bamber effect, we shall call it. Then on the 6th of August, he calls her at 10 p.m. and says he's going to commit the crime. He says it's tonight or never. She's stoned and thinks he's not being serious. And then he phones her in the middle of the night and says, everything is going well. There's something wrong at the farm. She's bleary. Her housemate's cross that the phone's rung. She sort of doesn't know what's going on, but she can't get back to sleep. She's really anxious. And then he next calls her to say the police are coming to get you, to bring you to the farm. When she sees him the next day, they're given a few minutes alone by the police. The policeman who gives them a few minutes alone says he's sure he hears Jeremy chuckle, but he covers it to be a cough. And Julie says that while they're hugging, he whispered into her ear, quote, "I should have been an actor." He later told her that a friend Matthew had done it, but she believes that he just used this as an excuse to sort of distance himself from it and to make her feel, I mean, less uncomfortable seems the wrong way to say it, doesn't it? But she said, and the whole time, including at the funeral, he persistently asked me if he acted right. And, you know, am I doing this right? Am I being believable? Acting Chief Superintendent Mike Ainsley said, quote, "I realised that I was listening to the horrific truth." At 7:45 a.m. on Sunday, the 8th of September, 7 weeks after the murder of his family, Jeremy Bamber is arrested at his flat in London, taken to Chelmsford Police Station. Brett Collins is also arrested as accessory, though he would later be cleared as having nothing to do with it, and I believe he was in New Zealand at the time. They make a search of Jeremy's house, White House Farm, Sheila's flat, where Jeremy and Brett had been living since the murders. And what's incredibly sinister is scratched into the wood in the built-in wardrobe in the twins' bedroom, which had, I believe, been Sheila's bedroom, they found, "I hate this place." It's unclear as to who wrote this. Jeremy, while speaking to the police, admits to breaking into Ossey Road. He says he wanted to bring home to the other directors and people involved in the caravan site that we were too lackadaisical. He writes a note to Julie saying, quote, "Sorry, we're splitting up, love you," in the hopes that she will retract her statement. Matthew, Jeremy's friend, is arrested because obviously this whole story has been that Matthew's done it. He says he hasn't spoken to Jeremy before Christmas. He says that Jeremy's never mentioned wanting to kill his parents, but I believe that they did have a falling out, but that's why they haven't responded. Meanwhile, the police are finding Jeremy rarely gives a straightforward reply. He smirks, he grins, he picks at his teeth and he pulls at nylon threads on his jumper. He's not really showing signs of distress for his family or, you know, hang on, if it wasn't Sheila, who was it? Who killed my family? Any of that. He just sort of smirks and is a bit of a smart ass. When the gun is fingerprinted, they find Jeremy and Sheila's fingerprints. Only one of Sheila's, and not in the areas that you'd expect to find them. They'd have expected to find more, especially if in the areas involved with reloading, gripping, and firing the gun. None of that's found of Sheila's fingerprints. Jeremy's told that it had been proven that Sheila had in fact been murdered and not killed herself. Jeremy's response is to stick to his guns. He said, "I think if I had been convinced that my sister had done this and it was then proven that she was murdered, I would be horrified." He just sort of is convinced she's gone berserk, she's done it. the police had spoken to him about, obviously, what he was doing at the time of the murders. And now they point out that the TV show he said he watched before he went to bed actually started 5 minutes after he went to bed. He said he got his timings confused. Again, this is totally acceptable. We all get our timings confused, especially if you're not expecting to have to give an account of your timings. But he is very specific on timings during his later appeals. He would be, very specific about when he phoned the police, when the police came out, all of that he's very specific on, but he's vague about what time he went to bed. They don't have enough to keep him, so he's released. And as soon as he's released, he offers to sell nude pictures of Sheila. She had an unfortunate modelling situation, which I'm sure lots of people have had who go into modelling, where she found herself doing nude modelling against her will. She got talked into it. And he now has these, I believe they're slides, and he offers to sell these pictures to the Sun as soon as he's released. Forensics continue, and they want to test Sheila's hand swabs. The ammunition used was covered in beeswax, but also they wanted to see how much lead was on her hands, especially as she had to reload twice. There should be a lot. Her nail varnish isn't chipped. There's no blood from anyone else on her nightdress, and they find that she has a normal amount of lead on her hands for anyone from touching everyday stuff, but not the amount that you'd expect from someone who'd committed this crime. They also identify the blood in the silencer as being the same type as Sheila's, so it fits that she was shot with a silencer, making the gun too long to shoot herself. Also, she didn't shoot herself once, go wrap the silencer up, put it upstairs in a cupboard, and then come back, get in the same position, and shoot herself again. They decide to rearrest with particularly interesting piece of evidence. There's no blood on the phone in the kitchen that Neville was allegedly calling Jeremy from. So he was also so injured he wouldn't be able to speak, and Jeremy is very insistent that this call took place. And Jeremy, meanwhile, has gone to France with Brett to have a holiday, and on the 29th of September, when they return, Jeremy is arrested. On the 7th of November, Mike Ainsley submitted his final report to the Director of Prosecutions, setting out his case. Criticism on this case is usually levelled at the police because of the handling of the crime scene and the slowness with which all the forensics was done. And that's something that comes up a lot on Reddit as well when people are talking about this, saying, oh, well, the police say, the family could have planted the silencer. If the family planted the silencer, there's no one checking up where he was. Yes, he left at 9:30, but he could quite easily have gone to London to hang out with Brett and or go to a party and had a really good alibi. There's not, it just seems very haphazard to me if this was a family thing. So Mike Ainsley says in his report, quote, although the scene was treated as a major crime scene, there was without doubt a certain lack of urgency in the submission of articles to the laboratory, and a mistake was made in advising the coroner that the bodies of the victims could be disposed of. Also, as will be seen from the statements of the Eatons and the boot floors, the police search of the premises failed to reveal a vital piece of evidence, namely the sound moderator. Additionally, the police failed to realise the significance of Sheila's appearance, i.e. relatively clean hands and nails, immaculate feet clear of blood. Also, the failure to realise that Sheila, in her nightdress, had no means readily available to enable her to carry around the necessary cartridges to reload the rifle at least twice. I make these points at this stage of the report as I feel strongly that the prosecution will receive justifiable criticism from the defence on these points, and it would be foolish for us to not agree that this was the case. 4 days before Jeremy's trial, Detective Chief Inspector Taff Jones dies at the age of 46 when the ladder he's on breaks. He sustains numerous injuries, but his skull fractures. And Taff Jones is a very controversial figure in this whole thing because obviously he was the one that decided that it was indeed a murder-suicide, and was very anti the family asking questions. It would have been very interesting to know. He had since been taken off the case and Mike Ainsley put in charge, but it would be very interesting to have known his response. Defense counsel Jeffrey Rivlin explained to Jeremy that the murder-suicide theory was very hard to prove and seemed more and more unlikely now that Sheila's blood had been found in the silencer. Jeremy maintained that it had been planted there by his relatives, an idea that Rivlin thought too far-fetched to even consider. I mean, it suggests a level of premeditation to frame and successfully get away with framing Jeremy. If the silencer had been left on the gun in the first place, then there wouldn't be any question of murder-suicide. There wouldn't be any question of murder, and they would have gone immediately to arrest Jeremy as the living family member. The fact that the silencer was removed meant he almost wasn't even considered. So, yeah, it just doesn't really work. A psychiatrist employed by the defense to examine Jeremy said he displayed a number of classic psychopathic symptoms, including a very real belief that he had not committed the murders. The psychiatrist was of the opinion that Jeremy did kill his family and had successfully suppressed the knowledge until it basically no longer existed. Quote, "If ever there was a psychopath," he concluded, "it's Jeremy Bamber," which is very interesting as the defense are paying for this psychiatrist, and it's not the outcome they would have wanted. But also for lots of people who go, how can he stick to his guns? How can he, never be so convincing? And this man has put in a lot of appeals. Well, he's convinced himself that it didn't happen, and therefore it didn't happen. So he is innocent in his head. So that is very interesting. Now, the trial takes place at Chelmsford Crown Court. The judge is Judge Maurice Drake. The jury is made up of 7 men and 5 women. And Crown Counsel is Anthony Ulridge. Ulridge's opening statement to the jury says, "If Sheila Caffel had shot herself, it must mean that she had shot herself once, injured herself, decided that she did not want to have the sound moderator on, gone and put it inside a wrapping in a box in the back of the gun cupboard, then walked upstairs and shot herself again. In human terms, that wouldn't make any sense, would it? Also, in evidence terms, we know that both shots were fatal, and after the initial shot, she didn't get up. The blood pooled in her neck. It didn't go down her, it didn't sort of come out and go down her dress. She didn't walk in it. So it just doesn't work. Over the first couple of days, we hear from police and those who worked with the family. The first member of the family is Pamela Boutefleur, who is June's sister, confirming that it's her belief that her niece would not have any knowledge of how to fire a gun. Her father, David, followed, and as other family members testified, it became apparent that there's hostility from the family towards Jeremy. Unsurprisingly, but I'd say to a man, the family believe that he is responsible and have no trouble believing he's responsible. And they all have trouble believing that Sheila was responsible. Not only is it a case of they liked Sheila, but they just don't feel that she is physically capable. No one can confirm Sheila ever having fired a gun, except for Jeremy said that she did. And not only was it reloaded twice, but over 20 bullets were fired, and all but one hit the target, which is impressive, because I was listening to a podcast episode about the Texas shooter in the 70s, and the first policeman on the scene shoots 6 times at quite close range to the sniper, and all 6 miss. And that is a trained policeman. This is someone who shoots over 20 bullets. I believe it's 25 bullets in total, and only 1 misses. This isn't a weak woman who is unfamiliar with a gun that is difficult to reload. The police have reloaded this gun to see how easy it is. It is difficult for someone who knows what they're doing to reload. And so we've got to expect that this weak, out of it woman is suddenly a good shot and able to reload. It just doesn't fit. Julie Mugford is on the stand for 5 hours for the defense. She cries a lot. She's obviously very distressed. She sticks to her story. That's another thing. Her story doesn't change. Ulrich keeps her for less than 10 minutes. One interesting witness is gun seller Robert Radcliffe, who clarified that it wasn't quite as simple as Jeremy claimed to detach the sight from the rifle as well. Jeremy was like, anyone could load that gun, anyone could put the sight on, take the sight off, put the silencer on. He says it's actually not that easy. Forensic expert testifies to the considerable quantity of Sheila's blood that was found in the silencer. It wasn't just a tiny bit. There was enough. Jeremy shows no emotion while his family's heavily blood-stained nightwear is shown to the jury. A number of police officers confirmed that at various points on the 7th of August, Jeremy's in a very jovial mood, joking about buying a Porsche, doesn't seem that fussed. And what becomes really clear is this case is pretty much, do you believe Julie Mugford or do you believe Jeremy Bamber? And Julie Mugford's story doesn't change. Jeremy has been proven to be a liar. Not necessarily in court, but we know that he's lied about Sheila being expelled, about Sheila being capable with guns. He states that on a number of occasions, Sheila has considered suicide because she wanted to go to heaven. She wanted to take people there with her. He maintained that he'd never said, quote, he fucking hated his parents. At one point, when speaking about leaving the rifle lying around, Ulrich said to Jeremy, quote, "You're not telling the truth about it, are you?" To which Jeremy responded, quote, "That is what you've got to try and establish." And it's basically then that it really felt like the sway had gone away from Jeremy. It's such a weird response to being questioned in court about the murder of your entire family. What also doesn't help is the witnesses called to give evidence on Jeremy's behalf, this sort of random collection of people who don't necessarily know him very well. Obviously, we've got all his family who are convinced of his guilt. But then we've got people who, like the manager of a snooker club, a few businessmen who'd dealt with Jeremy at OC Road, his very close friends, Sue Ford, Brett Collins, his ex-girlfriend, Virginia Reeves, his current girlfriend, are notably absent, that they're not called. Sheila's psychiatrist is spoken to. Dr. Ferguson, confirms that she's more likely to be vacant and withdrawn than manic or, quote, berserk, as Jeremy had said. She'd have reacted strongly to a perceived threat to her sons, but would not be the threat. Colin, interestingly, has always maintained that if the murder-suicide was true, Sheila would not be in the room with her mother. She would be in the room with her sons. In his summing up, Ulrich points out the strangeness of searching for police station numbers and not calling 999, and of calling your girlfriend. So this is a real thing. He calls the police, then he calls Julie. He says that he calls Julie because he, quote, needed a friendly ear. And that just seems... I don't know. It just doesn't sit well. You can never say how people are or should respond in this sort of situation. But it just feels very weird, doesn't it? It's in the middle of the night. You think your sister's going berserk at your house with a gun. You call your girlfriend for a chat. Rivlin points out that there's actually nothing putting Jeremy at the scene. There's no forensic evidence. Of course, his fingerprints are going to be on his gun. Of course, there's going to be evidence of him in his family home. And because we don't have the bodies, there's, nothing putting him at the scene whilst this was taking place. Years later, Judge Morris Drake would say, quote, "I kept an open mind until the evidence was building up, and there came a time where I came to the conclusion that Julie Mugford was telling the truth." The jury left the courtroom at 12:49. While they waited in the cells under the courtroom, so Jeremy gets obviously taken down to the cells under the courtroom while the jury deliberate. Jeremy speaks to his lawyer, Edmund Lawson, who found his client, quote, disconcertingly composed as he talked, quote, somewhat unattractively about how much money he would make from selling his story to Fleet Street. The jury returned at 5:59 p.m., unable to reach a unanimous verdict, and after a night in a hotel, they request further information from the blood expert on what exactly was found in the silencer. So, the blood in the silencer, some said, could be a mix of Neville and June's blood types, which together could make Sheila's blood type. And so they wanted to confirm whether this all wasn't the truth. They get this confirmed. It is not a mixture of blood types. It is Sheila's blood type. And after another 2.5 hours, the jury returned, still unable to be unanimous, but with a majority verdict, which is allowed. At 2:35 on Tuesday, the 28th of October, 25-year-old Jeremy Bamber is found guilty with a majority of 10-2 for the murders of his mother, father, sister, and 2 nephews. He's now considered a mass murderer, and he was given, quote, a minimum, and I repeat, a minimum of 25 years by Judge Morris Drake. Now, in 1988, this would be increased to a whole life tariff. Jeremy Bamber has appealed this a number of times. He first sought to have an appeal in November 1986, arguing that the judge had misdirected the jury. The application was heard and refused in April 1988, with Jeremy's defense saying that the trial judge influenced the jury. On the 20th of March 1989, the judges refused Jeremy leave to appeal, ruling that there was nothing unsafe or unsatisfactory about the verdicts. They did have a standard internal police investigation, which was normal for anything where it looks like something's gone wrong. And the police have always been very open about the fact that because this was instantly ruled a murder-suicide, it was not processed in the way it should have been. And so an investigation was launched into this. In 1996, a police officer destroyed many of the trial exhibits. Later told that he wasn't aware that the case was ongoing. And Jeremy's defense team then refer to this as a disgrace and imply that the police, there's just a lot of, it's all being framed. He's in, the wrong person's in there. In 1997, the Home Office passed Jeremy's case to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which had just been established to review alleged miscarriages of justice. It was referred to the Court of Appeal in 2001. DNA inside the silencer was found, and so because obviously this wasn't able, they weren't able to test for DNA in 1986. They could in 2001. This was counted as fresh evidence, but this, I think, just confirmed that it was Sheila's blood. Another appeal was held on the 17th of October to the 1st of November 2002. And the decision was published on the 12th of December 2002, and it was a 522-paragraph judgment. They concluded that there was no conduct on the part of the investigators that threatened the integrity of the trial, and the more they examined the case, they came to the understanding that the jury had been right. This whole case is so interesting because Jeremy Bamber puts through appeal after appeal after appeal, but also there is a huge rank of supporters for him who believe that he has been unfairly jailed. He's constantly leaking new evidence, as he calls it, which he says will set him free. It hasn't yet. He doesn't seem to have an explanation. He's very firm on the fact that Sheila is responsible, despite the fact that we know that basically Sheila couldn't be responsible. We can be 99% sure that the silencer was used in the murders, not only because we find Sheila's blood in the silencer, but because the boys were in bed. We know that Neville was injured to the extent that he wasn't able to speak. There's no blood on the downstairs phone. So how is Jeremy receiving a phone call from his father from the kitchen? There's no phone upstairs. Remember, the bedroom phone is downstairs. There's just too many loose ends that Jeremy seems to overlook in favour of ruling it a murder-suicide by his sister, and we have no explanation for. We've said it before, in times of crisis and fear, the first responders and paramedics and police, people on the end of that 999 line are your lifeline. Why go get the yellow pages out and look up? This is pre-internet. It's not a case of Googling. It is going through the yellow pages and finding the number for your local police station and then calling that instead of calling 999. It's making jokes about, if something's happened, I'm going to be able to buy myself a Porsche. Lying about your sister. Nobody expects you to love your sister. Nobody expects you to always have good things to say about your sibling. But lying about stuff seems very odd. Saying that the trustees were going to take the farm away, well, that's a lie. And why lie? If this is a murder-suicide, as you believe, why lie about the trustees saying? Why? That's what seems to be a problem for me in saying, Jeremy Bamber has been unfairly locked up. I genuinely don't think the wrong man is in prison on this one. I don't think we can say that an outsider, for whatever reason, broke in, left expensive things. To shoot children, it's not a robbery gone wrong if everyone's asleep. How did they get out leaving everything locked? If it's a third party, how did they get out? How did they know to get out and leave everything locked? Which means it must be someone in the house. So there are too many questions, and Jeremy is the only answer for me. I'd love to know what you think. And that is the story of the White House farm murders. I really would love to know what you think. There is numerous little tiny bits of this case that I've missed out because it's just, you can get really bogged down in the detail. And it is one of those cases, obviously the details are always important, but it is one of those cases where every little bit of detail seems important because you have someone in prison who is appealing and appealing and appealing, and there is a huge group behind him saying that he is unfairly serving life, which would be absolutely terrible. I will try and have something that we can romp through next week. It would make a huge difference to me if you can rate and subscribe and like this podcast, especially I believe on Apple Podcasts. It makes a huge difference. You don't have to write lots. You can literally just give it as many stars as you see fit. But in terms of getting this podcast out there and in front of people's earballs, it makes a huge difference. We also have a Patreon. There's loads of extra content on there. You can think of it as a little way to support me and my microphone woes, which I still haven't sorted out. I've been too busy end of terming, parenting, working my actual job, and reading this, just getting bogged down in the middle of the night thinking about, how good a shot you'd have to be if you're going to shoot 25 in moving targets and only one misses. Thanks so much for tuning in. I really appreciate you being here. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.